Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, very turbulent one, with Haiti in the midst of a rapidly rising death count after the earthquake, which followed their political quake, and of course Afghanistan, an unfolding calamity, as it has been off and on for decades. You've all been watching, and there's been a lot of pontificating, a lot of it by people who haven't been there. I've been holding off from pontificating because I haven't been there. A couple of our guests have, and also I was talking with my son-in-law yesterday, who was an officer in the Marines who served in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and we spoke for over an hour, and his perspective is very powerful and mixed. If anyone has a simple position on what's unfolding, I recommend re-examining it. Today, we're going to talk about an overarching issue that relates to what's unfolding in Afghanistan, relates to what's been unfolding for generations in Haiti, some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, some parts of Central America. There's a fragile states index, and the list is longer than it should be. And this is after decades of the Defense Department and State Department and others, and scientists and scholars trying to figure out ways to evolve our old norms of thinking about national security as sort of a reactive defensive posture, and more about a systems approach that looks at what are the fundamental drivers of risk in places that matter. Climate change, of course, is emerging as a global forcing in all of these arenas, not just in the developing countries, but right here at home too. I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute and Climate School, Columbia University, and have several wonderful guests coming on today. Linda Robinson from Rand Corporation. We were having some technical issues. I'm hoping she can join us because she's written extensively with a particular focus on the Middle East, on defense policy as it relates to stability and resilience, and not just defense. But my other guests are fantastic too. And so we'll get started here. Matt Barlow was at Columbia University for a long time at the Earth Institute, and now is at University of Massachusetts Lowell. He's an author, I think a lead author on IPCC. Is it the Working Group 1?
Working Group 1, yep, the water cycle chapter.
The water cycle chapter, yeah. We haven't talked. I had authors from the 3 working groups on a session last week, and it was really important for people to understand that this is really chapter 1 of a 4-chapter book, essentially the synthesis coming next year after the impacts and options sections. Thanks for all that thankless work you've done. Anyone here, or anyone who's been an IPCC author, or if you dug in deep enough to know how much work they do and how unrewarded it is, you deserve some kind of a medal.
Thank you.
Rod Schoonover, who was a National Intelligence Council ODNI analyst for a long time, under Obama and then briefly under Trump, is here again. He's been on the show many times talking about this question: how do we become more than responsive? How do we, and who's the we? How do you build actionable networks that can take signals from the situations that are evolving around the world and turn them into responses that reduce risk before the worst happens? And Mickey Glantz, who I got to know decades ago at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, and who has been he was one of the rare social scientists working with climate scientists at that time in trying to say, well, what do these models mean for, let's say, Somalia? And how do we boost the capacity to use the insights gleaned through climate studies in places that have the most climate vulnerability? So Mickey, I don't know if Fragile Ecologies is still an up and running blog, but
it's there, but I'm getting back to it. I'm getting back, and Spare Time University, all these great ideas, but other things push them to the side.
I want to do a session on Spare Time University. I think it's I was on the website. It looks really cool. Great. But that's for another day. So let's zoom in here a little bit briefly. I do want to touch on Afghanistan initially. I'm sure some of you saw this astonishing photograph inside one of the Globemaster C-17s. They had stuffed it with at least 650 people. And there was a lot of commentary. Oh my God, this is unprecedented. The plane's never been that crowded. And I did look back in Tacloban when there was the Typhoon Haiyan evacuation. It was actually more people being stuffed into the same bellies of the same craft. And so that says a lot, because what you're looking at here is the response to calamity. Oh, and here's Linda Robinson. Hello, Linda.
Hello. I do apologize for my technical difficulties. Let me not interrupt you, and I'll follow right along.
Well, it's just great to have you here. The work you've been doing, we'll get into it in a minute, and it is all related to this concept of thinking about moving from fragility to resilience. It used to be to stability, but stability is a funny word in a world that's changing so fast. So we'll talk about this. Just to reintroduce you, this is Linda Robinson at Rand Corporation, which has a weird name that it's stuck with, dates from many decades ago, but it's one of the leading think tanks, research hubs, security consultancies anywhere on the planet. The last time I had people from Rand on here, we're in a special session on deep uncertainty. How do we make decisions in deep uncertainty? I'm sure you know David Groves or Daniel Groves. And Rob Lempert has been on here several times, who helped found the Society for Decision-Making Under Deep Uncertainty. And there's a lot of that right now. But what I wanted to, you've written so much and you've experienced so much in this part of the Middle East. And what's on your mind right now? There's so many layers to this. We're not going to dig too deep, but in this when you think to this concept of stability, the role of defense, what we call the Defense Department, which is the biggest chunk of our budget, in making the world a safer place, what comes to mind?
Well, I want to thank you for that introduction, and my colleagues at RAND, and it's really a terrific organization. I do note, even though corporation is in our name, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution. And I appreciate, even though I will use the term stability, I think that is very important, the move to resilience, and I think terms do matter. That said, of course, for many years, the U.S. government has used for the military stability operations, for the civilian entities stabilization. And stability, of course, can be achieved by many means. And of course, stability in the Middle East can mean, in historical terms, backing autocrats so that they repress their people. So there are all kinds of issues around word choice. That said, if you don't mind, I'd like to just quickly try to answer your question in terms of the research we've done and the report that you kindly had contacted me about, which was finding the right balance, Department of Defense roles in stabilization. And that report, we were asked to really study what the roles of DoD had been through the so-called long wars. And we drew on a number of other reports and data and really came up with some key findings that are in the report. But broadly speaking, it was looking at trying to really match DoD competencies with their roles. And we came up with a broad conclusion that DoD really needed to move to a supporting role and let the civilian actors, which had deeper competence in these areas of how to actually stabilize a society and a polity, to do that. Granted, though, very critical support roles with the Department of Defense capabilities to provide platforms, mobility, logistics, this kind of thing, to help get things done, especially in these fragile states and underdeveloped environments. The other key finding, and this really relies on a larger body of work, not just RAND's, but which my time in the field, I think, in the books I've written about both Afghanistan and Iraq, was that we were overly aspirational and we pumped a lot of money into societies, which really fueled a lot of the corruption that was already an issue. But the issue really was simply turning on a fire hose of resources did not get the outcomes in large part that people sought. I do want to say, and we'll probably talk more about some of the specifics, there were gains in Afghanistan: infant mortality, girls in school, maternal mortality. So I don't want to just paint this as a black picture. But the overall finding was the way in which stabilization was pursued over these last 20 years was really in need of a fix. So they took our recommendations and actually rewrote the Department of Defense directive for what DoD roles and stability were. And that actually went along with a wider government project going on called the Stabilisation Assistance Review. And this was a very notable effort that involved U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department, and the Defense Department. And they came together on a series of findings and trying to look at a better and new way of doing business. And that largely mirrored some of the things I'm talking about, which is small can often be better, trying to really implement more rigorous assessment, monitoring, and evaluation. And to me, very importantly, trying to get the appropriate model. And simply, and if we're going to talk about the effort to build an Afghan defense force, not trying to replicate the U.S. Army, for heaven's sakes. And that was really the subject of my 2013 book, which was a more appropriate model, more local defense and more local consensus building and conflict resolution in a highly decentralized and varied society. And then we could talk more about other congressional acts, legislation, but I think there is a hope here that we're going to learn and implement some key lessons from these last 20 years. I know it's a crisis moment now, and I know many people are highly critical of the effort, that military-led effort we've been engaged in, but part of my work has really been trying to see what can we learn and what can we do better. Thank you.
No, that's very well put. And we're going to dig in a little bit more in some of the sort of the climate context, and then Rod, with his experience at the nexus of various flows of intelligence information, can talk about decision-making challenges and opportunities as well. I wanted to take us back in time a little bit to when I first met up with, one of the times I met up with Mickey Glantz and with Matt Barlow. This is not long after 9/11. I wrote this story about drought and Afghanistan. I had not been to Afghanistan. The closest I've been is the Persian Gulf, I think. Yeah. And that was in 1984. And we've heard a lot lately, including in the last climate report that just came out, about what's changing in the climate system in areas. If you look at that map, I'll click back to that map of fragile states, and a lot of them align with fragile climates, or at least sort of the edges of climate where we're not in our real comfort zone as a species. And so maybe, Mickey, you've been at this for, I don't know, 50, I won't say 60 years. Is it 60?
No. Well, I had a life before I did climate. And the life was revolutions, decolonization.
Interesting.
So I went back to the Portuguese colonies, and that was my master's, was on Angola. And then I did my doctorate on foreign involvement in violent political revolutions. My cases were Cuba, Yemen, and DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Well, putting Cuba aside, how you want to call that, fragile or not, the other two are a mess. And
for sure,
they had the same instability in the 60s as they have now. It's, I mean, the question about the Congo, should it have been 6 states instead of one country, that kind of thing. But it was anti-communist, so we kept it all together. Anyway, then I went on to the climate stuff, tired of wars and people versus people, and when people versus nature, and we can all come together to fight nature, fight climate, anomalous climate. And I found out that people use climate to screw other people. So coming to the more specific thing about Afghanistan, and I did a lot of work in the RLC Basin. And we always talk about the 5 Central Asian republics, the former republics of the Soviet Union. However, Afghanistan is 16% of the basin. the Amu Darya water, which used to be 70 cubic kilometers a year of water, perhaps Afghanistan was getting 1 cubic, nothing, almost nothing. And all the other water is basically being so overused that the sea basically dried up. Okay, the Big Arrow dried up.
Right.
Pretty much so. So
we've seen those satellite images.
Yeah. So all of a sudden now you have a new player, and it's Afghanistan. They've always been a player, but they're not playing. Set their drawdown to 0, but now it's not going to be 0. And I've just seen a slide showing Russians put together a slide, and the Uzbeks put together a slide, and it shows a ramp up by Afghanistan of using water from the Amu Darya, which they're the headwaters for. It's a bit, to me, it's if I had to come up with a kind of sort of an analogy, it would be like China and the Mekong.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to start damming things, making reservoirs, whatever, to use the water upstream, which really is going to be very critical for Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan.
Right.
With whom the Russians have alliances. I mean, it's going to get messy in a different way.
Yeah, and then maybe Rod, I want to get Matt to bring in the latest on the climate science as it relates to what you were just talking about. But Rod, I was just reading something about Afghanistan and minerals, rare earth minerals, and other assets. So there are these layers again, and I guess this gets to Linda's realm too in terms of security statecraft decisions as well. The U.S. is looking at Islamist extremism. They're looking at resources. They're looking at how water may destabilize these places. So Rod, if you were up in the office of the director, Avril, I guess it's Avril Haines right now.
Mm-hmm.
What are you saying to her if she says, Rod, what do I do here?
Well, all of those, and thanks for having me back on. I think it's my 4th time back on your program. These are tough questions, and these are, one of the things about Afghanistan is, and a lot of questions I've been getting this last week because I did a lot of work on Afghanistan mineral resources as mapped out by the Soviets in the 60s and 70s, and verified and expanded on by the USGS and the Department of Defense. And it was always this aspiration to assist, Afghanistan national government to be able to access and utilize these mineral resources in a way that would stabilize the country. But to get to that stage, you got to get past stage 1. Right, which is secure the country and stabilize the country, because mining is not a simple enterprise. It requires, just to piggyback on what Mickey was just saying, that it requires, depending on what mineral, it requires an enormous amount of water. It requires an enormous amount of power and infrastructure and a workforce, right? None of which have been expanded over the last 20 years, with some exceptions here and there.
Sure.
And so, this concept, there are the resources in theory, from an economic standpoint, that could assist in the development of Afghanistan and help to a developmental trajectory to stabilize the country. On the other hand, I don't think anyone thinks the Taliban is capable of undertaking a sustainable mining program that doesn't cause severe ecological damage in one of the countries that's already suffering environmental stress. And so, if I were talking to the DNI, I'd say we're looking at a rocky road from some fundamental issues such as human security and resource security you would not like to see. DRC was mentioned before. Well, DRC suffers from the so-called resource curse, and if you don't have strong governance, a lot of terrible things that fuel a lot of bad, societal ills can come in and access those resources. And just lastly, thinking about Afghanistan, I think it was really striking that after the United States went into Afghanistan, it was understood that we didn't really understand the human domain as well as we ought to have. And then Secretary Gates did a number of things. One was creating the Minerva program to understand, to access social science in a way to better understand that aspect. Arguably, we should augment that in terms of, environmental and ecological barriers as well, and better understand, and not just Afghanistan. All of these other countries, I think Afghanistan's number 9 in the Fragile States Index last time I looked. There's like 30 that are in the extreme case. So more understanding, I think, of these environments is really necessary.
I'm going to get to Matt in a second, but that raises a question I have for Linda, and for all of you perhaps, which is that what you just laid out is interesting in the context of whether the Biden administration engages or disengages with the Taliban, because clearly a mining enterprise generating wealth and doing all the things the Taliban might want to do requires an educated class. Right? It doesn't mean back to burqas necessarily. And I just was looking, China is already in the wings waiting to work with them. So Linda, do you concur that that layer is really vital to think about too?
Yes, absolutely. I want to just appreciate the comments made before, and I think particularly what Rod is saying, I think, is the integration of climate and environment into development and security policy making at a fundamental level is a huge, in my experience, that really hasn't been integrated at all. And with many of these fragile states and the entire Middle East really on the front lines of climate change, I think this should really be high up. In terms of Afghanistan, we are at a really dynamic moment right now. I think it's hard to say with certainty how U.S. policy is going to evolve and what the actual Taliban 2.0 is going to look like. They're saying a lot of things that indicate they're going to proceed in a different way, but no one can really put faith in those words. We have to see actions, and we don't know yet. But I think the statements that the administration has made previously was they were very much going to use the leverage of withholding certain assistance, withholding certainly recognition, to try, that's its only remaining leverage really, to try to influence the direction the Taliban goes. We don't know what kind of brain drain will occur there. Obviously, Afghanistan does have an educated class, but it has less than other countries. If it goes into full-blown civil war, what I think will be a massive refugee outflow will become a profoundly massive outflow. And then finally, you mentioned China. The U.S., of course, has really put that up now. I think the continuity in national security policy between the previous administration and this one is really seeing China as the major, as they call it in the Pentagon, pacing threat, or I would say more generally, just a major competitor that has to be contended with. And China has probably a more mercantilistic approach to Afghanistan and will seek resource development there as long as there's a security provider. So what we've all seen, of course, over these last 20 years is China will not invest at all in promoting stability. It does have major contracts like the INEC mine. They will develop when it behooves them, but they're really not going to underwrite development. And unfortunately, I think their model is they import Chinese labor rather than using the local labor. But I think the stage is set if the U.S. doesn't come up with a coherent policy that tries to use leverage, but also really tries to help people at this critical juncture. And maybe it means working tactically with the Taliban if they're willing to play ball. Otherwise, we'll cede the field really largely to the players in the region, which will be China, which will be Russia, Iran, of course, and Pakistan.
Very good points. Let's get back to climate and how it relates to fragility. This is the 2021 Fragile States Index, the Fund for Peace puts out. And, there's all kinds of discussions about how you measure it. And all these words are hard to measure. Resilience, adaptive capacity. We did a whole session here on adaptation and the inability to clarify how you do that. But here we have Yemen, Somalia, Syria, South Sudan, Congo, Central African Republic, Chad. And then here you have here's the map. And let's just zoom in. So Matt, thinking about the IPCC findings, the latest chapter, and the work you've done for more than 2 decades, and we just were talking about this intersection of climate and water and conflict. What's the most illuminating thing that's new and might provide some traction?
Well, traction is a difficult piece. I mean, I would in 2000 with that drought. That's when I first was introduced to the region, and we were looking at global drought, and that area really leapt out as an area of exceptional drought. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, it was on the ground fairly apocalyptic. Massive crop failures, livestock death, internal migration, villages abandoned, wetlands dried up. So it was an extremely severe drought, of course, impacting the women and the most vulnerable members of the population most dramatically. And it sort of jumps out on that map along with other regions in Africa, of course. But so that was the climate of 20 years ago. You got these really exceptional droughts. Transboundary water issues are a huge issue for the region, as Mickey was talking about. So drought is a very challenging situation, even in the climate of 20 years ago. So what's alarming? I don't even know. I don't have a word for different levels of alarming past some point, but the climate of 20 years ago was exceptionally challenging in the region, and we're going to, especially in that area, add a whole new level, unfortunately, of challenges. So there are some things that we have a fair amount of certainty in, and some things we're less certain of. But one thing that's certainly certain in that region, in Afghanistan, is that a lot of the water comes from snow melt in the spring. As the snowpack melts, and there's no question that there's going to be less snow and more rain in the winter, and that snow melt will happen earlier. So one of the key pieces of water supply in that region is going to change pretty dramatically, no matter what. It's just a question of how much it's going to change. Right. Water will become more intermittent. There's a chance that droughts will become even more severe. Dust storms. I think the high temperature record in Afghanistan is something like 122 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius. So that's our current climate. So we're going to be adding to that pretty rapidly. So it's climate change. The current climate was already extremely challenging, and climate change is, especially in that region, is really going to add a tremendous additional level of difficulty.
And Mickey, one of the things that I've realized in looking at the climate issue since the 80s is there are these enduring areas of significant uncertainty. I was talking about deep uncertainty before, and the hydrological consequences of climate change are so much more murky than the heat. Heat's kind of straight. I wouldn't say none of it's easy, but it seems more established, more straightforward. And you look at like sub-Saharan Africa, the latest models are still kind of mixed on whether to get, well, actually, it's mostly going to get wetter. I guess that band south of the Sahara. But what kind of wetness? How much of it's heavy rain? You're still going to have like what I think they're calling it a whiplash climate. When you have those levels of deep, basic physics uncertainty, and you have drivers like you have in these areas, high fertility rates, turbulent, conflict-prone politics and stuff. What have you learned in those 40 or 50 years? Like, is there some fundamental principle to work on that can head us again toward resilience of facing that kind of landscape?
Okay. There probably are. Okay. There are think tanks everywhere, and they're all massaging these concepts. I like resilience, but resilience, when I say resilience, it may not be the same as you think resilience is. A lot of people think resilience is kind of an elastic band. You stretch it to the limits, it bounces back to where it was. Now they say, oh, now it's built back better, and so a lot of these phrases we use, really, I use them, but if you look into them, they've got their weaknesses.
For sure.
Even frailty. I looked up frailty, and the opposites, their antonyms. It's like avoiding frailty is looking for firmness, solidity, strength. Okay, resilience. It's what's the opposite? It's inflexible, rigid, stiff. So it has different meanings. The country was destroyed, but we rebuild. Okay, so the resilience is human resilience. It's not the environment. The environment's screwed, and you figure out how to live with it. So I have trouble with a lot of the words actually that we're using. Even fragility, resilience is the word. Oxfam wrote in the last decade, like around 2010 or 8, 10, 12, saying resilience is going to be the new buzzword. It used to be vulnerability replaced by adaptation, replaced by something, like even exposure. A lot of these words used, they're great. They're our mental models, but they're not necessarily shared by other perceptions of that same word. Okay, so I think there are people who live and survive in the Danakil Depression. Okay, it's worse than a harsh environment. It's not for me. Some people live in forested area. It's not for me, but they seem to somehow adjust. And there are books about how cultures change when people get moved to ecosystems they weren't familiar with. How their attitudes change, personality changes. Anyway, so there's no silver bullet here, and we always talk about adaptive capacity, but there's also, and in Afghanistan it was growing, but it's an absorptive capacity. You can give them everything, but do they know how to use it? And so that requires the education and training. And going back to something Linda said, I mean, really, the U.S. has a problem itself, okay? Because a lot of the problems in these countries, these fragile places, deal with corruption. All right, I remember the word bakshish. Back in the 60s and 70s. Oh, to make a deal, there's got to be bakshish. There's got to be some payoff to somebody, and corruption leads to distrust in the government, in agencies, in personnel. So we have it in America, which, by the way, I happen to see is on this kind of slippery slope of fragility. We became more, So I'm worried, and so the beacon on the hill, maybe that's not what we want to be or do or approach or trust. Okay, whereas when China goes in and makes a deal, okay, they say we're not humanitarian aid, we are a business, and so through the Belt and Road they managed to do a lot of stuff. Afghanistan, rare earths, the Chinese already control a lot of those. How about some more? I mean,
right.
I think if we're talking about different things here, but Afghanistan's got some real problems. I'm not sure the Taliban are going to turn kissy face to the West, frankly. The global North has fragility too. That's one of the points.
Yeah, I was looking at the 2021 index, and as you said, the fastest rising ones are include us. Here it is, biggest increase in fragility 1 year, United States. Now this is from a low baseline. We're still a very functional country, sort of, not necessarily for the pandemic. But then you're right behind is Armenia, Spain, Ethiopia. Ethiopia is having a lot of trouble right now. So that, but again, let's dig in on this. I mentioned the Global Fragility Act, which I was late to. This sort of sneaked past the news cycle for most of us, I think. And it was signed by Trump, quietly, I'm sure. Rand Paul tried to block it because anything that involves, I guess, engagement with the world outside our borders is not something he would pursue. And I know, Linda, you have a lot of thoughts about this and have been involved in this concept. So setting aside the word fragility, what is the goal here? And I know right now, I guess the question is, which countries do we, under the law, we have to identify 5 or 6 countries pretty soon. How does this play in this question?
Yes, thank you. If you'll permit me, I would just like to say very briefly about stabilization. That term really is about post-conflict stabilization, for those within this sphere, and then reconstruction. So stabilization really literally just tries to stabilize after the crisis and get the immediate needs met. It's different from humanitarian assistance in that it actually is trying to affect systems. Reconstruction, and then you have development. Development is traditionally understood as the build back better, right? Let's actually improve the basics of that society. So I think there's a logic behind that nomenclature. I understand the climate folks here are dealing with another rubric, which I think resilience, mitigation, adaptation. And I think, we have to be realistic and grapple with the facts as they are. I mean, I think the science here has to guide the naming of things. On the Global Fragility Act, I'd like to take you back to the narrative I laid out right in my first intervention. The Stabilization Assistance Review was a very important document that began to say what was wrong with the past approach, how can we improve it? And part of it was trying to get more modest about what we know, what we can do, and have a better return on investment. Let's at least try with what dollars we are putting out there and what effort to understand better and improve better. So out of that, then it really in tandem, that was 2018. Then in 2019, there was a task force on extremism in fragile states. And that was a bipartisan task force overseen at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And out of that really became the impetus, because they work very closely up on the Hill. They're funded by congressional dollars in large part. And out of that came the Global Fragility Act, which again had bipartisan backing on the Hill. So it wasn't just a Trump thing. It happened to get passed during his administration, and that legislation was, I'm looking just to make sure I get the statistics right, $200 million annually over 5 years to establish a more coordinated approach to preventing instability and extremism. And then in addition, $300 million annually for 5 years to establish a complex crisis fund. So the way I look at it, having looked at this for quite a long time, is an attempt to refresh and redo the earlier efforts to build at State Department the Office of Conflict Resolution and Stabilization, SCRS. And I think that it has enough legs. It required a strategy. You're right, picking 5 countries. The strategy was put out under Trump. But right now, and I want to just check a certain friend of mine, but she's nominated to become the Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization. And her name's Ann Witowski. And she was on the task force. And this is, I think, a project that has buy-in from both sides of the aisle. And hopefully they will move forward in a concerted way to really improve our approach. Sorry for being so long-winded.
No. This is really valuable. And I know it sounds like this answers a lot of, or at least it addresses a number of the questions I've talked with Rod about before, and also Mick Mickleby, who used to be the Joint Chiefs advisor on these things, and Alice Hill and Amy Lures, who was in the White House on adaptation. Does this feel, Rod, like it's moving things in the right direction?
Well, yes. So just a couple comments. I think in Linda's report from, I think that was 2016, which I read as a sitting member of the intelligence community and watching the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilisation operations really find its legs. I think one of the things that we on the outside, especially since I've left government, we fund them, and as really brutally illustrated by COVID-19, is this great need for a shift in national security doctrine. And one of those things is a recognition that national security does not equal whatever the Pentagon is working on, and the great need for deep engagement by the Department of State, USAID, and the federal science agencies in the national security discussion. And so I think deeper engagement by not just CSO at state and not just USAID, but I would say other offices and bureaus that aren't traditionally thought of in terms of stabilization. And again, those of us who have looked at ecological and environmental trends with some amount of dread, it gives us some pause when the initial cut at how to operationalize this Global Fragility Act doesn't mention climate change or environmental degradation at all. And so, those elements in the State Department and USAID that work on climate and environment and the like, I think are not just helpful. I think they're integral to really stabilizing and building resilience under conditions of accelerating Earth system change. I think the idea that you could stabilize societies and nations without a deep appreciation of what's happening literally under our feet, I think it's policy madness. That said, I think there's an appreciation in the government, in the Trump administration and in the Biden administration, that needs to happen. But there's so much inertia in the traditional way of thinking about conflict and stability and reconstruction that it's hard to get those, the drought aspects and the ecological network pieces into that. So it's a heavy lift, but it's certainly the vector, the trajectory is in the right direction.
I'm going to swing back to the IPCC briefly, because just a week ago, the focus of my Sustain What session with the 3 IPCC authors and with the vice chairman of the 5th assessment was on the need for what you're talking about, even within the science community. Meaning right here, I've got social and physical scientists. And I know you guys engage a lot as at Columbia, the IRI group and others, CSIN, they're all about engaging the data with outcomes in places that matter. But it's still here, 30 years in. I wrote about my global warming story in 1988. So long ago, there were cigarette ads on the back of the magazine. Before the IPCC was formed, I've learned so much more about the need for that kind of crosstalk. So it's like, and then that has to funnel efficiently into the decision process. And Matt, I think actually, Rod, you were on the session we did just when there was about what Biden can do to improve science advice. Yeah. And one of the things was elevating the science advisor to the cabinet, which has happened.
Right.
So again, incrementally, things seem to be shifting now. Of course, and what you said, what Rod said that was so valuable. And I think it was you who said it's not because he's there or she's there to just present a report at one of those meetings. It's to build sustained, conversant comfort and trust with the other cabinet members.
That's right.
So that when something arises, there's more actionability. So building this like interface, somewhat of what I'm trying to do here feels like it can help that process, but it seems so slow.
It is
Linda,
slow.
actually, you said something really interesting, Rod. You said, I love government. And I think you did, unless I was mishearing. And I think about younger people right now. It feels a little bit like the 60s to some extent, although maybe a little different. It's like, oh, government sucks. Do you all sense, are you talking to people who are young and want to get into that interface? Maybe we'll just go around the circle here. So Matt, I talked about the IPCC first. So is interdisciplinarity becoming more than a buzzword?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the science side, people are very interested in it. I know the IPCC is focused a lot more on that. There's a lot more discussion between the different working groups. There's, and I know individual scientists. I don't know of really any physical scientist who isn't interested in making those connections better. I work in an interdisciplinary department. We think about those things all the time. I think, as Rod was saying, there's still kind of this gap to be bridged, and I'm still a little bit at a loss as to how to accelerate that. I think there's a lot of very valuable information produced by the IPCC and many others, but it doesn't seem to be making its way into policy very effectively or very critically. And of course, from the climate change point of view, I don't want to get into doomerism. It's not, we have 10 years to act and then nothing, but this is a really critical time to act quickly, and it feels like we're still acting very slowly. So I do think, people are very interested in that on the science side and working very hard on it, but I don't think we've figured out how to close the gap quickly. In terms of young people, I think people are very interested. Young people that I've talked to are very interested in governance, but kind of from a different model in terms of a much more kind of activist engaged model. I think what will come of that is still to be seen, but I think there's a lot of interest, but not so much in the traditional model.
And Linda, you at RAND, you interact with everybody. You've been dealing with the Middle East, which is such a hot button, perpetual one. And what do you see in terms of youth engagement?
I live in Washington, so it's all going to over-determine probably the number of people attracted to the policy world. And I sense there's the other pole, which is the tech sector, just really attracting a lot of the same type of energy that we might find attracted to government. But the idea is how those elements can work together. And I think I'm hopeful, actually. There was also the Commission on Public Service, and this, I know I'm referring to a lot of governmental efforts, but there's a recognition there is a way to serve your country that doesn't mean in uniform. I mean, my first career as a journalist, I felt I was, going out trying to find information to help and inform citizenry. So I guess I've always felt like I was serving in my way. Mm-hmm. But the Middle East, if I could just say, I think we're really, and I appreciate being part of this conversation. We've been doing some work. First of all, we had a report out in February called Reimagining U.S. Strategy in the Middle East. And I think you displayed it there on your screen for a minute. And that was really trying to say, let's shift. We know we're not going to get more governmental resources, but let's really rethink what we're doing with the resources we're putting out there and trying to get to some more productive policies and less a military focus, although security assistance is important, but let us really try to focus on the long term. And part of that long term are not only the structural issues with the largest youth population, largest unemployed population, but climate change front and center for all of these. And when you look at that global fragility index, I'm not a climate expert, but I think all of them are really the highest, most fragile, are deeply advanced in suffering impacts. I do not see, though, that it's integrated into government policy and strategy. And I think we should look to the national security strategy and the national defense strategy that are currently being written to see if they really integrate, not just have a section or a paragraph on and climate, but as Rod and others have been saying, what's the intersection with conflict? What are the immediate impacts, and how does policy need to adapt and perform, be an intermestic approach? And I would salute Sherry Goodman. I think she is already calling for DOD to really not have its climate policy be just about which bases are going to go underwater or which jet fuel. It has to be security and climate.
Yeah, Rod and I have had many discussions about that too.
Right.
And something that there's this other imbalance, which I've had on this show, is the amount of social science on climate risk versus the amount of physical science, and then or on the sort of energy solutions. If you look at the investment in the social sciences on how and why people make decisions, on sources of vulnerability, it's this tiny sliver of overall investment. There was a study by Indra Overland and some Sovacool came out in January that was jarring and just describing how little we really have put into understanding those other drivers of risk. And I keep trying to remind myself, should have this tattooed on my forehead, the risk formula. Risk is exposure times hazard over capacity or incapacity. It really needs to be just here. So I see it every day in my computer screen. There's lots to go forward here on, and actually what Linda said about this being an opportunity because of the defense strategy being crafted now and some people still getting into place. Maybe we could just close things out in the next couple, it's only really a couple more minutes, around what's the story that can be presented to folks there that could make a difference. Look, we have the IPCC report out too. Unfortunately, the next two won't come out till next year, and that's where they're the ones that matter most: adaptation and mitigation. But if there's something I can do, like if I was going to do a follow-up session here, whether or not it involved you all, who should be on, and what's the core question that might help get this in the foreground? So we're not just building back; we're building forward. And actually, Linda, let's start with you one more time because. You're a first timer here. I know Matt is too, and Vicki. So what's the Zoom? What's the thing that's in your head when you wake up in the morning that people aren't resonating sufficiently around?
Oh, wow. Well, I have to say, I think I'll just reinforce what you just said. If there are findings that are coming out next year and there's a way to advance or have those authors on to discuss what those findings are, because that's the problem with, how government works is once these strategies get crafted and published, a lot of the wheels of government flow from that. So I think the timely, now is the time to really get some key findings. And I want to be kind of humble here because I am not a climate expert. We are working with our Climate Resilience Center to try to craft, and there are some actors in the Middle East. UAE, Emirates is I think the most forward leaning to really trying to put it front and center on their domestic agenda, but also become a leader. Qatar is also doing that with resources. But I think it's very important to crystallize what are the key actions, and not just in the security realm, but in the development realm. And even though she's pending nomination, usually people are quiet. I would reach out to Anne. I think that she is, even though she's only one entity within state. I think we need to see if state is going to bring together security, conflict, stabilization, and climate. Because I think if you can get DOD and state being proactive on this and feeding them some specific recommendations, you might really have some impact, but it would need to happen in the next month or so.
Interesting. Well, I'll see what I can do. We are kind of out of time. Mickey, there's much more for us to catch up on. And Matt, maybe we could zoom in a little bit on water, do a session going forward on the water question. I'm just posting a graphic I pulled together for the session I just did on vulnerability and basically working group 2. There was a woman.
Can I offer up a question as well?
I would love to have your final. Yeah.
So I think one of the really interesting things that has happened last year is the National Academies of Science issued its recommendation to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And one of the recommendations was to shift to a risk assessment and analysis framework, which I think is a long time coming. And, coupled with the elevation of the science advisor and his staff to cabinet level, I wonder if there's not a greater interface between the U.S. GCRP conversation, the conflict, stabilization, and reconstruction conversation, as a part of the larger national security evolution that is underway, whether we codify it, in our documents or not. And so I tried to bridge that gap while I was still in the intelligence community, but it's quite ad hoc. And it seems to me there's just a lot of fruit to be borne by a deeper relationship between security and science with a nexus in that office.
That's good because, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, from a sort of, if I had to headline it, I would say, not as a national security expert, from the climate side, it's hard to imagine that any national security strategy can be successful without a very large focus on climate, an integral focus on climate at this point. So to me, that's the bottom line. If you want a successful security strategy, the climate piece has to be front and center. Sorry, and getting a severe weather warning.
Right, it's probably the tornadoes we had this morning.
Yeah, we're getting.
I woke up to one of those.
And in terms of what can be done short term, I think, while folks on the mitigation and adaptation working groups can't talk about the report, I mean, the reports are based on peer-reviewed science, so that there's lots they could talk about now, even if they can't specifically reference the reports. The reports are really more about, I think, leverage and publicity. They're rarely about big surprises because they have to be based on established research. So I'm sure you could find some folks who would have a lot to say, even if they can't specifically reference the report yet.
Yes, I'm going to do a session with Lisa Schipper, and Ed Carr was just on recently. Who's
great
big
choice.
in that room.
Friend of mine.
And that, Ed's amazing. So great. Thank you so much, everyone. Linda Robinson at RAND, Mickey Glantz, Fragile Ecologies, and just master of mitigating disaster, at least hopefully trying to do that. And Rod Schoonover, intelligence analyst at the Nexus of Climate and Security, and Matt Barlow at University of Massachusetts Lowell. And great to reconnect with all of you and to connect with you, Linda, for the first time. And I will follow up on some of those suggestions. So this is a wrap on the session of Sustain What, which is brought to you by Columbia University's Climate School and Earth Institute. And also I have this new blog at revkin.bulletin.com. I'll be synthesizing some of what we've just spoken about in a written post coming up the next couple of days. And just keep at the work you're doing. You're all invaluable on this turbulent, fast forward planet. Thank you again for spending some time here.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
And these will all be, they get archived right away and can be shared on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, wherever video is flowing. So thanks again.